There are some things that you would want to use quantum computers where they're much faster. Classical computers will still have their role. They're not going to be fully replaced. But it does give us some algorithms that are actually now feasible that weren't feasible otherwise.
This is KBcast.
As a primary target for ransomware campaigns,
is security and testing and performance and scalability.
Risk and compliance.
We can actually automate that.
take that data and use it.
Joining me today is Samuel Tseitkin, founder from ExiQuantum, and today we're discussing the golden age of cybersecurity, the quantum era. So Sam, thanks for joining and welcome.
Thank you for having me.
Okay, so I want to start real basic. Now, I've touched on quantum on the show before, but not in any sort of fidelity that you're going to go into today. So let's just start there. What is quantum?
Sure thing. So basically, if we really want to get into the most high-level description of a quantum, it's basically the very small world, you can say. So small that the laws of physics themselves change. Gravity no longer takes effect. It cannot really be truly observed because it's smaller than the particles of light. And it's just basically a whole new world of physics that is completely different to ours, and we have no idea yet why, essentially. This is a kind of a crazy world where everything acts differently, I've mentioned. Like, for example, a particle, let's say a quantum particle, for simplicity, would be at all positions, at all potential outcomes for that particle. So it will be like, say, going right, going left at the same time until it gets what's called observed, meaning like basically we look at it, not in the literal sense, because we can't look at it, but as in observe it physically. While we're still trying to learn how it works, we already can utilize it, like a lot of other things. Like, you don't need to understand a computer to use it. So thankfully, we can create computers using quantum physics somewhat. Basically, when I described how a particle can be all outcomes at once, imagine this being applied to a computer circuit. So what are some potential outcomes for computer circuits? It would be 0 and 1, as we all know, the binary circuits. Now, because quantum particles are all outcomes at the same time until they get observed, it means that quantum circuit, or as we call it qubits, quantum bits, is 1 and 0 at the same time, and everything in between, until it gets observed. And then once it gets observed, it collapses into 1 or 0 or something in between, by chance, essentially. And without going too much into it, basically what it does, because it acts differently to classical bits, it gives us a whole new amount of opportunities, amount of new types of algorithms that we won't be able to run otherwise. So it's not like quantum computers are omnipotent. And there are some things where classical computer still shines. A good example I like to use is, for example, who would you trust more to tell you what's 5 times 5, ChatGPT or a calculator? Most people would say calculator. So same with quantum computers and classical computers. There are some things that you would want to use quantum computers where they're much faster. Classical computers will still have their role. They're not going to be fully replaced. But it does give us some algorithms that are actually now feasible, that weren't feasible otherwise. So that's basically it. Before we go into the impact on cybersecurity, I think that's a good high-level explanation.
Okay, so there's a couple of things in there that I really want to get into. You said the 0 1s, but at the same time, and then in between. Like, what does in between look like?
Basically, the way that quantum computers work, the way that qubits work, is essentially chance. If it's 1, for example, if the circuit is 1, there is a 100% chance that it is 1. If the circuit is at 0, there is a 100% it's at 0. So something in between is there is a 40% chance that it's 1 and 60% chance that it's 0, or 75% chance that it's 1 and 25% chance that it's 0. So it's not like literally something in between, but statistically, as I mentioned, it's a very high oversimplification of the actual workings of it. So essentially, when we observe it, there is a chance of it collapsing into the states between 1 and 0, if that makes sense.
But that
as
doesn't
much.
obviously work in like a more of a binary sort of traditional classical sort of computing, right? It's like 1 or 0.
Yes, so with classical computers, there is a 100% chance it will be 1 or a 100% chance that it will be 0. And if there is a 100% chance that it will be 1, then we know that there is a 0 chance percent it will be 0.
Yeah, okay, wow. All right. So then on that note, so you mentioned before there's still going to be like a need for like classical computing. So like give me an example of like where we'd need to leverage classical computing over sort of quantum computing, for example.
It's really hard to tell at this time. We don't know exactly what algorithms quantum computers will never have. We know that, for example, they have some algorithms that are much more useful than the classical computers, but we have barely scratched the surface of their potential. So we don't know exactly what algorithms will pop up that will be able to replace classical algorithms. However, there are plenty of areas where while quantum computers might be able to be utilized, classical computers will just be a much better choice because it's much easier to manufacture and stabilize. As I mentioned, coming back to the AI example, that's another emerging technology. You could theoretically just go to ChatGPT and ask it, what's 50 times 150 plus 29 or something? ChatGPT might be able to answer you that, but I would trust a classical calculator a lot more. And it's not because, and then like, when it comes to how easy it is to manufacture a calculator versus ChatGPT, you'd think it would make more sense than in that case to use a calculator. So essentially, classical computers will still be useful for a lot of functions. You just said for some algorithms, we don't know yet exactly how many, quantum computers are significantly more useful. So they might be more useful for, say, certain professions, certain companies, like government organizations. Not everyone needs a supercomputer, for example. So not everyone will need a quantum computer.
So you mentioned before that we, like as an industry, are still figuring out like what we know. So then what is the current state of affairs? Like what do we kind of know at the moment? And then would you classify quantum in a similar bucket to like AI, for example? Because there's still like lots of questions around that. Obviously, AI has been around for probably a bit longer and there's a bit more functionality around it and there's a bit more ubiquity around it. But then like, what do people like yourself actually know about quantum in terms of like the knowledge generally speaking out there?
Okay, so we do know that, for example, there are some algorithms that quantum computers are like immensely better than a classical computer. And when I say immensely, I mean, numbers that are hard to grasp, like billions of times better than classical computers. Like, for example, with optimization problems, that seems to be where quantum computers really shine. Or, for example, unluckily, it's extremely good at breaking down prime numbers, like prime factors, calculating the prime factors of a number, which technically that's what our cryptographic system, like that is currently utilized for almost everything, relies on. Like a classical computer would take literally billions of years to calculate the prime factors of the massive numbers that they utilize for cryptography, but a quantum computers will take maybe a few hours at most, like when they reach the scalable state that we're referring to. We also know that there are a lot of challenges to get to that state, mainly around qubit stability. Like in terms of numbers, we are doing all right. I think that IBM already has a couple of thousands of qubits, but qubits are extremely hard to keep stable. So for example, we talked about the chances between 0 and 1. It's hard to keep them that way. It's hard to actually maintain their data and not lose it. Also, there is a lot of noise. So when trying to decipher the data that the qubits are conveying, you can get a lot of errors in the middle that kind of skew the results. And those are challenges that a lot of companies are trying various degrees to various different approaches to fix. Like, for example, Microsoft recently published a paper, which is now pretty controversial, but I will not be getting into that. They claim that they use the topological approach to create quantum computers that are available in room temperature. I think IBM utilized near zero temperatures to maintain the stability of the qubits, but there's still a lot of trouble in that area. So we know that we're still relatively far. We don't know exactly how far from having a scalable quantum computer, but there are already like massive uses for algorithms around biology, logistics, health, and of course, cryptography.
let's look at Microsoft, for example. So when, Microsoft or even IBM brought out computers, originally speaking, they weren't sort of meant for personal computers, but obviously now we're at that point where everyone's got a laptop computer, etc., right? So do you think quantum will follow down that path if we look at sort of the previous pedigree, or what do you think on that front?
I think I kind of didn't really dive into your parallel with AI, and I think that kind of ties nicely into this as well. It's really hard to tell, as I mentioned. Quantum computers are they're very different to AI and classical computers in terms of how you maintain their state, etc. But looking at parallels that are visible, like, for example, the fact that AI just 10 years ago wasn't anywhere, like it was just a niche usage for essentially technical people for specific use cases, and suddenly it blew up and now it's being used by everyone. While it's the same was the case with classical computers, and it always was the case that it started off as very niche usage and required to be very big and require a lot of energy. And then it became smaller and became somewhat available to people. Like, for example, AI technically is still not available to a lot of people. You got to use a cloud service that can provide those servers who will hold the data. But slowly that's becoming decentralized as well. And I think already some devices hold a local AI instance. With quantum, there is a possibility there as well, I think. A lot of people would disagree with me, but just following the patterns, technically you can already buy a quantum random number generator from some companies. You can already access a quantum computer via cloud to say IBM or I think AWS and use an actual quantum computer. So yes, I personally think it's only a matter of time before everyone has basically a hybrid quantum, classical, and potentially AI devices that will not be as powerful. Like, for example, I do think that the topological room temperature quantum computers are not as powerful as near zero temperature, near absolute zero. But it's still, so, it's going to be useful for individuals, while the big companies and governments will take the equivalent of a quantum supercomputer, if I'm making sense.
Okay, this is really interesting. Okay, so going back to your hybrid approach, and you are right, it's too early to tell. Who knows? It could happen, but no, I like your thinking. So going back to the hybrid approach, so I think you've sort of touched on it. So you've got your Microsoft, IBM, and friends. Are they now making a play to start to create these hybrid? Obviously they're already dabbling in the quantum arena exclusively, but this hybrid sort of machines that you spoke about, are these vendors like Microsoft and friends making this play now that you're seeing?
I haven't heard anything about it. It's a very big, I heard some things being touched about it, like people mentioning it and how it can be potentially useful. I haven't heard a significant effort to do that. And I reckon it's because it's just a bit too early to look into that, because we need quantum to become viable first. But I think that it's going to be potentially also the key on how to solve some of the issues with quantum, such as the maintenance of data. Like a classical computer data is significantly more stable. So I think there are already applications of running the algorithm in quantum, getting the results, and quickly storing it in a classical computer so that we don't lose that data. So there are already uses for it, so I see no reason why there might be some low-key, low-profile work around it as well.
Okay, so just to touch on this a little bit more, so I interviewed a guy, Matt Watts. So he wrote a book around the fourth wave, and he sort of spoke around, because he's been in the industry so long, around these waves of different technologies. So he spoke about modular technologies, virtualization, and cloud computing, and then obviously now they're talking about intelligent data infrastructure. And then I asked him what do you think the fifth wave is, and we sort of touched on quantum. And I know this is a bit of a hard question, but I'm just trying to get a bit of a broader from you, Sam, around when new technology comes out, there's always going to be the naysayers. There's this, there's that. It's not going to work. Even with cloud computing, for example, even when the internet started up, people were like, no, it's not going to be a thing. And it is, right? So how long would you sort of anticipate, based on what you do every day, will it take for people to start to really get across this? Because even if you look at AI, it's been around for ages, but in terms of the uptake of the everyday person, that was in late 2022. And we're 18 months or so into this, AI being so ubiquitous, and like you said, everyone using it. What are your thoughts then around predictions for the quantum uptake, quantum computing more specifically?
Yeah, if I may, the naysayers, so to speak, the skeptics, are starting to grind my gears a bit, so to speak. Of course, skepticism is healthy. We shouldn't always just say, oh, everything. Like, there's also, of course, the other extreme where people are starting to say how, AGI is just a year away and quantum computers will break our encryption tomorrow and there's absolutely nothing that can do about it. But at the same time, I think it's borderline dangerous approach sometimes when people just say, nah, it's not going to happen. And therefore, because of it, we are being caught very unprepared. Like, for example, the internet has made quite the impact. Now we should go, for example, to social media. We're seeing quite the adverse effect on society because we're just not prepared for it whatsoever. Now AI, same here. We haven't really prepared for it. So it's already starting to affect the workforce and other areas of industry in ways that we hadn't seen coming, such as like deep fakes and misinformation, etc. And because we were just so unprepared for it, the adverse effects are going to be magnified, like on the workforce, on misinformation, on everything. However, with quantum, it's actually going to be next level in terms of the danger, because here we're talking about all our encryption systems, which are basically the only reason that, emails, banking, etc. can exist, just being broken down. Now, there are a lot of big players who are already acting on it, the big tech giants, but, really big kudos to them. But I have seen a lot of people who handle a lot of data and infrastructure who just kind of, take the wait and see approach. They're like, well, we don't know if it will happen. I don't have to act either until the government says I have to, or I get hacked, which is way too late. Like, if you act, say, until a month before Q day, then all your data has probably been harvested for later decryption. And I also heard people say like, oh, well, who's going to harvest my data? No one with a quantum computer is going to harvest my data. But the truth is, somebody who harvests your data doesn't need a quantum computer. There's a lot of organizations and countries, malicious countries and organizations, who will possess a quantum computer, who will be happy to buy or sell their decryption services, if you will, to any hacker who just decides to harvest any data that they like, creating kind of like a black market of harvested data. So I think I went kind of on the tangent on how dangerous this type of skepticism can become. In terms of when will people understand, sadly, I feel like until we do, either we get punched in the face, we have some sort of Y2K. Well, hopefully the best case scenario is a Y2K scenario where everyone got protected from quantum decryption and all post-quantum has been adopted before any real damage was made. And everyone is like, well, here it's all around. What's the big deal? What was the fuss? So I see two potential scenarios, either a real punch in the face, which I hope doesn't happen, which is the biggest data leak in history, or a Y2K scenario, where it's all around us suddenly and people don't understand what was the big deal, at least until quantum AI comes to be and some other things.
Okay, so going back to the naysayers, so the people that are saying like, oh, this won't be a thing, are these like people that are like ill-informed people, like everyday people? Because I mean, like, when I'm doing interviews, like I like to do a bit of reconnaissance out there, seeing what people are saying on all different types of social media platforms. People that have a security technology background, and then just everyday people that really don't. So it's just good to get a bit of a gauge on where people are sitting on that front. So the people are saying, oh, no, this won't happen. Are these people that actually even know what quantum means, or are these just people just hearing the word and then just sort of refuting it?
Well, that's a concerning part. I wasn't talking mainly about the, for lack of a better term, your average Joe, like the one who doesn't handle the security of a company. It's been head of cybersecurities and CISOs that I've been having those conversations with. Of course, a lot of CISOs have been extremely receptive. A lot of CEOs have been extremely receptive and have had very fruitful discussions and collaborations. But there is still a concerning amount of CISOs, CTOs, and more who probably have more short-term priorities, or at least they feel that they have more short-term priorities, and sometimes even borderline veto the project. Like, for example, the CEO says, I think we should look into it. And the CISO goes, well, I don't think we need to look into it yet. Maybe let's continue to monitor the situation, which again, a lot of voices are saying how the planning and the transition is going to be significantly longer than people think. It's going to be a lot more complex because we're talking about upending a lot of infrastructure and replacing it. Like, I'm personally trying to make it easier, but there is no way to actually make it super easy and super seamless. So it is a bit concerning seeing that people who should be at the forefront, I'm not sure if it's controversial to say, but I think that there is some ego at play there as well. They don't like being caught not knowing something, not being the smartest guy in the room about something. And therefore they kind of get defensive and skeptical about it. Hopefully it will continue to improve. I've seen signs of improvement over time as more governments are talking about it, more organizations are talking about it.
So you mentioned before, Sam, how do you prepare? Like, we got to get prepared, but like, how do you do that? I mean, if people don't even understand it, like, how do you possibly get prepared for something like this? Or what are your sort of insights around that?
That's a really good question. I mean, everyone talks about, adopt crypto agility, have a look, maybe write some documents on step-by-step process, but it's still a very tricky process. It also depends on whether you rely on third parties or if you want to use a vendor or if you want to do it in-house. And if you do it in-house, do you want to have a consultant or like outside expertise, or do you want to build it inside as well? So I would not, like, for the sake of brevity, I would not break it down too much. But I guess, I think that a good 3-step process I've been discussing with people is the discovery phase, the remediation phase, and the maintenance phase, which may lead to the cycle repeating. So first, there's the discovery phase, where you need to look into the tools you're using or the encryptions that you're deploying. For example, if you use a third party, you need to really dig into them, ask their intentions about post-quantum, and check if they have any sort of roadmap or plans to make the migration. If they respond as vaguely as a lot of people do, maybe you can look into switching to another provider who has mentioned that. Like, for example, for TLS, Flare has already adopted post-quantum, but I know some providers who have not. And when I spoke to them, they say they don't really have any plans to do it. If, for example, you want to do it in-house, you need to look into the algorithms that are being used for encryption. Like, do you have any places where you use RSA or elliptic curve? Basically, look into the asymmetric encryption that you're deploying and check what type of encryption is utilizing. Kind of shortening the process, but basically from there you'd go into the remediation phase. As I mentioned, with the third-party tools, you might want to switch to the ones that have already either planning to, like, have a good date on when they'll do it, not like, oh, we'll do it when the time comes, or if you have it in-house, look into the newer algorithms that have been selected by NIST or ENISA or a few other organizations that are deemed to be quantum secure for now. However, keep in mind that they are kind of newer algorithms, so people need to prepare to also have to make it again, migration again. That's where the crypto agility term comes from, because lattice-based is already showing some signs of weakness, for example. So people are already talking about migration to code-based cryptography, barely a year into the lattice-based cryptography standardization. A lot of people find it daunting. So for them, I would recommend potentially looking into hiring a vendor or a contractor who has specialty in that, if you don't want to spend too many resources on doing it yourself. Otherwise, feel free to just hire a cryptographer or use the other third-party tools. After that, there is a maintenance phase, which is, as I mentioned, continue to monitor news, like about how the status of the algorithms that you have adopted and seeing if they're broken into, because that happens a lot. And I guess from there, hope for the best.
Hope for the best. Okay, fair enough. So then just zooming out for a moment, what do you think in your experience people just don't get about quantum other than the whole thing? But was there any sort of more nuanced pieces that you can sort of talk through?
Sure. So this kind of touches on AI as well, and potentially the internet. I don't think I was old enough in the internet age to see the parallels, but basically people have trouble understanding exponential growth. So if we're coming back to AI, for example, there's been a long period where people have been saying that AI is very far away from being able to actually even be a chatbot. And I remember trying the chatbots back in 2018. They were not exactly optimized. And then suddenly there is a boom. And now every day there is like a new massive breakthrough with AI that opens new doors for a lot of applications. And this therefore makes it hard for us to understand both how fast and how slow it's progressing. We don't know how fast now AI will get to AGI because we don't know how long we have until AGI. We just know that it's advancing faster and faster towards it. Same with quantum. There have been it was always 15 years away. People have always assumed it's going to be either 15 years away or 3 generations away. And now the estimation, for example, for Q day has been pushed forward quite a bit. I think at first it was 2045, and then it was 2035, and now a lot of people put it at 2030. Some people even Gartner, for example, puts it at 2029, and it might be even before that. Therefore, we can't really delay things. We shouldn't like panic and say it's going to happen tomorrow, but at the same time, I don't think I personally understand exponential growth, and I don't think anybody else really does. So you need to really prepare that there is an actual possibility that it's not just that quantum computers will come not in 15 years, but in 5 years.
So do you think people are panicked though? I mean, based on what you're saying before about certain sizes are like, oh no, I can't even think about that. They got enough to do. So maybe there's a bit of fear, overwhelm, that sort of feeling sinks in. But going back to the panic, do you think people are panic stationed now, or what do you think's going on out there?
There is a mixed reaction, I think. But yes, there is an upcoming panic. As I mentioned, with the exponential growth, there was nothing about it. And suddenly, basically around late 2024, there have been an explosion of news of breakthroughs with quantum guidelines and regulations passing all around the world. Suddenly, there's a lot of noise about it. People were not prepared for it. Therefore, like you mentioned, some panic and therefore go into kind of denial. Some panic and just get daunted or don't know what to do from there. And definitely important to be calculated and prioritize it. But there's a lot of resources available as well for people who want to take, say, a step back and kind of start the steps one by one. There's also a lot of vendors out there who are willing to help out. Just maybe you can edit this part out if it's a self-insertion. There's a lot of vendors out there who are willing to help out and provide services or assistance or consulting that will make it significantly more feasible for companies who have no idea what they're doing. So I do think it's kind of a mix. I mean, not humans have all kind of views about it, but I think it's definitely important not to panic while at the same time not be overly skeptical, if that makes sense.
So then how does quantum and security sort of talk to one another, correlate, work together, wrap around? Walk me through that, and what does that look like in your eyes?
Basically, as mentioned, with quantum, we kind of got unlucky that one of the first quantum algorithms that came to be is SMAC, the algorithm that can break our encryption system. So that's the first result. That's the first effect of quantum on cybersecurity. But I don't think it's necessarily a bad thing. I mean, every technology have a good side and a bad side. And that is kind of the bad side effects that we need to look when quantum is coming. However, at the same time, quantum is offering a very strong boost to security. Like, for example, we can already use a quantum random number generator to create significantly stronger keys than what is being utilized by most people now, which makes it significantly harder for, say, differential attacks by AI to break symmetric keys. There's also some smaller scale application of quantum key distribution, which is a theoretically unhackable utilization of quantum to create a secure channel. So theoretically speaking, it's possible that quantum will also be the end of hacking, at least in some areas, in some applications. So we need to kind of look at it as kind of a new horseman, if you will. I think that D-Wave, for example, recently came out with a quantum-based blockchain, which is significantly more secure and fast than classical blockchain. So there is that, for example. It can also power AI, make it significantly stronger, which might also amplify the adverse effects of AI. But if we are prepared, then we'll be able to just mainly show the benefits. And same with security. There is a lot of adverse effects, sure. But if we are prepared, if we now do the proper steps, I think we're also facing a golden era of cybersecurity, with quantum being actually amplifying security rather than hurting it.
Okay, so going back to your comment before, you said by leveraging and using, quantum computing would eradicate like hacking, for example, right? Because of the encryption that it does. So if companies, businesses, etc., aren't leveraging quantum computing, and correct me if I'm wrong, that means they're still going to be vulnerable, susceptible. But if they are, you're saying that we're not going to have the problems that we're facing in today's climate?
So as mentioned, like QKD is theoretically unhackable, utilizing quantum physics to transfer the keys. So remember when I mentioned how qubits collapse when they get observed? Basically, that's what we do with a key. We create a quantum key, and the key collapses if it gets observed. So we send that key to the other party, and if it gets observed on the way, it collapses and no longer works. So it's essentially hacking key distribution.
And then it becomes absolved then, is that correct?
Yes, exactly. The key got observed and therefore it no longer is usable. So the other party knows that someone was listening in and has to restart the process. There might be some ways to beat that process. I mean, hacking evolves just the same way that security does. But yes, it would be very useful for low-level applications such as underwater cables that are using or satellites that are used for today internet. I think China and Russia claim that they collaborated together to create a secure satellite communication. Yeah, so the thing is, a lot of companies will not need to utilize quantum computers. It will be their internet provider who does. So if, say, the tower that communicates to their phone, which might have a mini QKD module to create a communication, like theoretically speaking, with the tower that is unhackable. So it won't necessarily be something that companies have to do. But even companies themselves can already, if they won't have a quantum computer, if like QKD modules won't become widely available, they can still adopt post-quantum cryptography, which is technically what the roadmap that everyone is talking about implies will happen. Everyone will adopt post-quantum cryptography because it's a lot more accessible, and then some use cases will be adopting QKD, quantum key distribution.
So then on that note, are Telco and friends adopting this? Or where's their sort of head at then?
We can't adopt QKD quite yet at scale. There are some trials happening. I think some very, very high-profile telco companies around the world are trialing it out, mainly in Southeast Asia, China, Europe. Although I think both Europe and America are more focusing on the post-quantum cryptography. It's kind of like, China has their approach, so we have ours. But it's slowly developing. I think at the moment there is a very high limitation of the distance that the key can be sent through before it basically dissolves. So there are some challenges to conquer that before adoption can actually start. But I do know some telco companies, I'm not going to say names in case I get it wrong, are trialing it out.
Okay, so just to connect the dots a bit more, hypothetically, telco adopts this technology, which then permeates through people leveraging the internet. Therefore, if you got some cyber criminal on the other side of the world, they need the internet to be able to hack X company, business, etc. But then that becomes eradicated because the quantum technology has been adopted from, is embedded in even at the telco ISP sort of level.
Yes, that's the best case scenario. That's the internet, the quantum internet, as people say. That's kind of one of the projects will be unhackable.
So then what happens to other vendors? Do they just become obsolete or what's going on there?
So they can still adopt post-quantum cryptography, but that's a good point that you brought, that sadly this type of technology will only be available to the bigger ones, and the rest are going to be significantly fallen behind in terms of that. They can potentially offer other technologies that are more accessible, like PQC or quantum random number generators. But technically speaking, it's like how already big companies have, supercomputers and large servers that give them the advantage over smaller businesses. I'm sure that there are some innovative solutions or pricing options that smaller telcos might be able to innovate with to grab more market share. At least that's the hope.
So Sam, given everything that we sort of discussed today, where do you think we sort of go from here? Like, I know there's a lot of still questions, unknowns. It's not expecting you to sort of have all the answers. It's just more so just getting a bit of a view from yourself who's doing this day to day. You've obviously got experience and working in it. But what do you think we can expect moving forward?
In what regards, like in terms of developments?
Just adoption to quantum is this going to be a real thing? Because I caveat that with saying, because like Web3 example, that was like crazy topic for a while, and then I don't really hear much of that at all. So I don't know, wherever your mind goes, because again, it's still one of those topics that's not a lot of information about it. Not a lot of people have a lot of experience. Not a lot of people even know it exists or what it means. Wherever your mind takes you, I'm just really curious to hear your thoughts.
So in terms of blockchain and Web3, for example, the use cases were significantly less clear. But I think AI would be a better example where the craziness is a bit more warranted, while Web3 and blockchain, there's a lot of work to be done in Web3 and blockchain. However, with quantum computers, I think sadly there is sadly or fortunately, depends who you're talking to, there is absolutely no question that this will be happening. There is way too much preparation and attention from governments all around the world to say otherwise. And for example, recent breakthrough like China, this Chinese university has managed to break a smaller version of the encryption today using a quantum computer. It's a very much smaller version than the one we have today, so there is still some time before it can actually break our encryption. But I think what this indicates is that this threat is no longer theoretical, because before that, we just had the mathematical algorithm showing that it will be able to break our encryption. But the fact now we see, practically speaking, it can, and it's just a matter of scale. So maybe there is a very small chance it will not happen, but the chances that it will happen are way too high to wait and see, so to speak. So developments will continue there. However, cryptographic innovations will also continue. I mean, there are already a bunch of post-quantum algorithms that are both coming and have already been adopted or are ready for adoption that we think should be safe for much longer period of time. All encryption breaks. There were a lot of encryption algorithms that ended up being broken. That is the arms race between hackers and cybersecurity experts, essentially. And this is just a bigger jump in terms of the stakes. But there's a lot of work being done to mitigate that, and a lot of things that every single person, every single company can already employ to fix it. And not all of them require anyone to be a cryptographer. So
Sam, do you have any sort of final thoughts or closing comments you'd like to leave our audience with today?
Yeah, sure. Just maybe wrap it up is, as mentioned in the talk, don't be too skeptical. Don't go into denial. This is going to happen. But at the same time, don't panic. There's a lot of work being done to mitigate this. And there's a lot of steps you can take to help yourself, whether you're an individual or a company. There are a lot of resources to help you as well. So yeah, just stay safe, stay quantum.
This is KBcast, the voice of cyber.
Thanks for tuning in. For more industry-leading news and thought-provoking articles, visit kbi.media to get access today.
This episode is brought to you by Mercsec, your smarter route to security talent. Mercsec's executive search has helped enterprise organizations find the right people from around the world since 2012. Their on-demand talent acquisition team helps startups and mid-sized businesses scale faster and more efficiently. Find out more at mercsec.com today.